Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Other Brother by Lauren Baratz-Logsted, narrated by Henrietta Meire. Part 1. London. He sucked all the air out of the room. Jack's dad had asked about the agency, and Jack had replied about how well things were going. He'd even started to tell about our exciting plans for the summer, when Denny cut him off, launching into a tale about some gig he'd done in Malaysia the week before. As Denny went on and on and on, I saw Jack's face fall. Well, who can beat a gig in Malaysia? We were in the sitting room at my in-laws' house, having pre-dinner drinks. My husband and his father, Bert, were side by side on the sofa. Bert's a big-bellied, burly man with mutton chops, a look he's favoured the whole time I've known him, the mutton chops having long since gone white. Bow-legged, Bert always looks like he'd just climbed off a Harley. My boys were pretending to play something on the floor, not too far from Denny's swinging foot. There was so much pent-up energy in that swinging foot. Of course, Denny was seated in the best chair in the room, by the fireplace. Me, I was standing with my drink next to the occasional table, the one with family photos blanketing it. There were several pictures of my sons, one for each year from womb until now, and several of Jack, including our wedding portrait. I'm sorry to say I looked like a giant confection in it. Blame the dress on the princess dye fervour that had still been going on 2 years after her own wedding, which was when mine took place. I'd choose differently now, if I could. As for Denny, the only pictures of him on display were from when he was a small child. Really, on the entire lower level of the house, there was no other evidence that he had ever lived there, which had been part of the problem, once upon a time. I suppose he'd say that it wasn't his fault, strictly speaking, that the air went out of the room whenever he spoke. He'd say that the room was too small to hold him, that he was more used to arenas, and sometimes even those weren't big enough. And if he said that, the world would agree with him. Not many people can get the whole entire world to agree with them on a single thing, perhaps because most people aren't known by pretty much every living person on the planet. But my brother-in-law can, and was, simply because my brother-in-law was Denny Springer, lead singer for the greatest rock-and-roll band in the world, or, as it's usually printed in mags, the greatest rock-and-roll band in the world, like it's an official title they've earned or an award won, like the Booker or the Nobel. Even in remote parts of the planet, people knew who Denny Springer was. Why, I read a story once, in one of those same mags, about one time when Denny was contributing to that charity album that was supposed to save the rainforest. They helicoptered him in, and some woman came out of the bush, or whatever it's called. As a travel agent, you'd think I'd know these things. And even though her tribe had supposedly never had contact with civilization before, after her initial shock at seeing him, she'd launched into an off-key rendition of Frustration, his signature song, after which she had him autograph her bra, which, if I remember correctly, was made out of polished gourds. It's safe to say that the world has cut Denny some slack at every turn. It's even safer to say that I never have. Thankfully, Edith called us all in to Easter dinner then. Physically, Edith often reminds me of the main character from Keeping Up Appearances, only much shorter and minus the faux plummy accent. She always wears dresses, and there's almost always a belt high up that only serves to accentuate the firm ball of tweed-covered belly below. Edith is also frequently hysterical, but not in a funny way. At least, though, as she loudly shrieked for us to come in to dinner, she was saving us from hearing more about Malaysia. Or so I thought. Not that my sons needed it. Saving, that is. The way they'd stared at their uncle, like he was some sort of celebrity or something. Well, who could blame them? They'd seen him on the news or on the covers of magazines countless times. But in person? Hardly half a dozen. In the dining room, without thinking, Without even asking Edith where she wanted us all to sit, Denny immediately settled into the seat at the head of the table. I saw Bert open his mouth, preparatory to objecting. It was his seat after all, his house. But then Edith jabbed him in the ribs with an elbow as she set the platter with the lamb at the foot of the table instead, giving her husband an amused eye-roll and a jerk of the head in the direction of their eldest son. Despite the condescension in that jerking head and those rolling eyes, I knew that Edith didn't look down on her son, necessarily. It was more like both she and Bert were eternally puzzled by Denny, and not a little frightened of him too. Once, while watching a televised program of one of his concerts with them, Bert shook his head in confusion throughout, and Edith was heard to mutter, "I thought he was going to be a maths teacher." Now, the man who'd been meant to be a maths teacher was opening a case he'd kept close by since arriving earlier in the day, and removing a large device, from which there came a ringing sound. "I've been expecting a call," Denny said importantly, punching a button on the device and placing it to his ear. "What is that?" Bert asked. "It's a mobile phone," Denny said, covering the speaker with one hand. Of course, there were smaller mobiles available by then, but Denny would have to have one that looked more ornate, like something the Queen might use. Or Batman. "A phone," Bert said. "Look at that contraption. A phone in its own little suitcase." He snorted. "I can't see those ever catching on." Looking annoyed, Denny rose from his chair and exited the room to continue his call in private, stopping only long enough to snag a hot cross bun from the basket Edith had put out earlier. My boy's eyes followed him like he was a god. And at the table, silence. The only noises were the sounds of Denny talking and laughing his end of the conversation in the living room. After a full 10 minutes, the realization dawning on all of us that Denny wouldn't be returning any time soon, Jack offered, "I suppose we might as well go ahead and eat then." "We can't eat Easter dinner without your brother," Edith said stridently. "Why?" Jack said. "We've been eating Easter dinner without him for 20 years or more." "And that's the point," Edith said. Strident as she might naturally be, it was rare for her to say no to Jack. She loved him. Really, she did. "He hasn't been here in so long it wouldn't be right." A firm nod of the head. "We'll wait." All this talk about how long it had been since Denny was home, coupled with him not even bothering to remain at the table, did make me wonder, just why had Denny come home? Even if Jack hadn't persuaded Edith that we could start eating, by speaking up he had broken the ice, so he and Bert went back to talking about the travel agency again. They'd gotten as far as rehashing what had already been said, business very good, booming really, and Jack was once again on the verge of sharing our summer plans, when Denny returned. Without so much as an apology, he reseated himself at the head of the table, crossing one skinny leg over the other, as he lounged back in his chair. "Where were we?" he wondered, and then, not waiting for an answer, "All right, Malaysia." Bert finally carved up the lamb. Then my eldest handed a plate to Denny, my eldest's hand shaking like he were making an offering to a god who might smite him if displeased. I worried Denny might say something rude or mocking, but to his credit, he steadied the plate with his own hands, all the while giving my son a high-wattage smile of reassurance. That is a thing about my brother-in-law. A total arsewipe. But then there are these glimpses of blinding, block-out-the-sun charisma. And in those instances you see exactly what the world sees. Why there are women who would, and have, walked on broken glass to have one of those smiles directed at them. And a moment later, "Lamb's cold," Denny announced. Well, for fuck's sake, what did the man expect? I can't say he used a complaining tone. It was more like he was making an empirical observation. But still. He pushed the plate slightly away from himself, only half-heartedly picking at the potatoes and veg as he took us on a whirlwind tour of his recent experiences in the East, near and far. I winced at some of the sex-drugs parts of his sex, drugs and rock-and-roll anecdotes, but there was no stopping him once he got going, and I could only hope my boys didn't know their hookers from their hookahs just yet. Perhaps it was all gobbledygook to them. "You should eat more," Edith said when Denny paused for breath. "You always were a skinny lad, but you're a grown man now. It's time you put some meat on you." Oh, he was grown all right. How old was Denny now? I did the numbers in my head. If I was 33, Denny was 42. For quite some time, like a moon attached to a planet, I'd always known what my age was in relation to Denny. To his credit, again, Denny ate some more of the lamb, which really was dreadfully cold, before pushing the plate aside for good. When Edith tried to protest again, he put her off with a wave of the hand. "I'm not really that hungry today," he said, immediately belying the words by grabbing another hot cross bun. This he only picked at, fingering off the sticky icing and popping his glistening forefinger into his mouth in a way that, under other circumstances, could only be deemed sexual. It did occur to me, as it must have to Edith, that a man like Denny must almost always be hungry for something. He simply wasn't hungry for mum-made lamb and potatoes and a proper veg on the side. I felt bad for Edith then. As my boys got increasingly older and independent, or as independent as they could be at 9 and 7, some days I felt all I could do for them, as each step in life took them further from my womb, further from my home, was to provide a good meal for them and love them. But poor Edith. Denny, his taste buds long since grown accustomed to the most exotic cuisines and the finest chefs in the world, couldn't or wouldn't let her do that. Hell, the man had his own personal world-class chef. Everyone who reads the mags knew that. There are times, I must confess, that I do believe I spend too much time surreptitiously reading the mags or trying deliberately not to. The main course finished, I helped Edith clear the table for dessert. She'd just brought the pudding in, when Denny reached into his inside jacket pocket, drawing out a packet of French cigarettes. He had one out and between his lips, a gold lighter flicking in his other hand, that lighter probably weighing more in solid gold than everything in my jewelry box combined, when Edith shouted, "You can't smoke that in here!" Denny was so startled, he nearly dropped his unlit smoke. "I can't," he said dumbly. Edith pointed with vehemence at a sign on the sideboard, "Thank you for not smoking." I knew that sign. Edith had similar signs which she'd put out the year before, in every room in the house. Honestly, it was impossible to believe that Denny had missed them. "Christ," Denny muttered. "It's worse than America." Edith ignored that. "If you must smoke that," she said, "you may do so outside. Pudding can wait a bit." Why not? We'd waited for the lamb for a half hour. At least the pudding couldn't go cold, since it already was. "Your dad and Jack can have an after-dinner drink while we wait for you," Edith added. "And if you're going, you can take the dog with you for a walk." She paused before yelling, "Digger!" The previously unseen Digger, a spaniel, came scampering out. You'd think he'd have been around earlier, but Digger often hides when we come to visit. The boys have a tendency to carry him around by his armpits, as a result of which he has a tendency to play dead without anyone asking him to. Dumbfounded, Denny dropped to one knee and gave the dog a good scratch on the head and belly. "I can't believe you still have Digger," he said. Honestly, the man really was a prat. Did he really think this was the same Digger from when he was a child growing up in this house? If so, the dog would be over 200 years old in dog years. In the time I'd known the Springers, I'd seen at least one Digger come and go. "Dennis!" Edith laughed, as though surely her son must be joking, while I was equally certain that, surely, he was not. The scratching hand stopped mid-scratch as he stiffened at that Dennis. For over 2 decades now, he'd only ever been Denny or Den. And that old familiar must have rankled with its reminder that he wasn't always the stuff of groupie wet dreams, that once upon a time even he had been a silly little boy, capable of saying extraordinarily foolish things. The front door of the Springer house, which is not a particularly large house, is in full view of the dining-room table, and Denny was just turning the knob as I rose. "I think I'll join you," I called. I felt more than saw Jack glare at me. Jack hated it when I smoked. But screw that. I hated how hard it was to stay slim after having 2 kids. When I first met Jack Springer, 12 years prior to that Easter dinner, I had no idea who he was. Or maybe it would be more proper to say, I had no idea whose brother he was. We met in a pub, which I believe is every young girl's dream, to be able to one day tell her children, "Your father and I met in a pub. We were both fairly wasted at the time." I was there with my best friends, Stella and Bria. Back then we called ourselves the 3 A's, because of the final vowel sound in all of our names. Well, we thought we were clever. It was karaoke night, and we'd already had our go at it with Every Breath You Take, complete with hand gestures like shading our eyes visor-like and telescoping our hands every time we sang I'll Be Watching You. Nothing like a little stalker music. Stella and Bria had met 2 guys to while away the night with, and so I was on my own at the bar, finishing up the bottom of a G&T, when I noticed a man on the stool next to me, watching me. For all I knew, he could have just got there, or he could have been there for the last hour. That's the thing about Jack as opposed to his brother. You can't miss Denny, while Jack takes a lot longer to show up on the radar. It's not that Jack's bad to look at, far from it. It's more like his looks sneak up on you, one of those all-round average types who start to look better and better the longer you know them. But you'd never peg him as being related to someone possessed of one of the most famous faces on the planet. For one thing, even leaving off the height discrepancy, they don't look a thing alike. Jack has close-cropped sandy-coloured hair that starts to spring back into curls the instant he steps from the shower, kind brown eyes, as opposed to Denny's sea-glass eyes that have only a few flecks of brown. A smile that's more reassuring than Denny's 100-watt grin. Denny's mouth, when he laughs so wide, it looks like he could eat the world. And in addition to being tall, unlike his slightly older brother, Jack is sturdy and strong. If you had to guess his profession on first sight, you'd likely guess copper, and not one of the corrupt ones either. So, as I say, there's no reason, if you didn't already know, for anyone to connect the 2 men. And so I didn't. "Can I buy you another one of those?" he asked with a chin nod toward my empty glass. I looked him over again. Already he looked better, if only by the barest of increments, than the first time I'd glanced at him. I could certainly do worse, I finally concluded, and in fact, many times I had. "Sure," I said, raising my eyebrows expectantly, hoping he'd guess what I was searching for. He did. Jack. He filled in for me, and nothing more. Well, it wasn't like I needed to know his last name. We'd probably converse for exactly the amount of time it took me to down my fresh G&T, and that would be that. It's not like I'd need to know his whole name for my Christmas list or anything. It's not like we were going to be picking out his and hers towels the next day. Of course, as it turned out, we wound up talking through several rounds of drinks. Well, mostly I talked, at least in the beginning. That's the thing about Jack. Unlike Denny, who can only be depended upon to talk about what he's doing and what interests him, as though he expects the whole world to be waiting for every utterance, hanging on every last word, which I suppose, to be fair, they do, and unlike any other man I'd ever met, Jack was all about finding out what interested me. So I told him how I was at loose ends, how I'd recently graduated from university, and having gone to school to study one thing only, to realize near the end that it no longer suited, I was killing time working in a bookshop, until the right idea for what to do with my life came along. That may not sound like much to tell another person, but you'd be surprised how much time you can consume talking about how adrift you're feeling when you're drifting on the effects of about half a dozen or so G&Ts. So basically I just nattered on, while Jack mostly listened. Except he didn't just listen. My recollection of events in the days to follow, and right up to now, is that he interjected, with meaningful comments at appropriate points and with humour in the few moments when I grew maudlin over my own sorry state. As for that humour, it wasn't like he was laughing at me, although eventually I started laughing at myself, and it wasn't over-the-top hilarious, it was just nice and gentle. Like him. In fact, I was just thinking about how surprisingly nice this all was, this man, this talking thing, that it was the most pleasant evening I'd enjoyed in I didn't even know how long, when some guy doing the karaoke launched into frustration. And that's when Jack rolled his eyes, accompanied by an inexplicably sad shake of his head. Before I could ask him about that, he changed his own subject. "I heard you and your friends earlier," he said, singing. "You weren't half bad." "Poof!" I shrugged off the compliment. "Anyone can sing along with the bouncing ball." "What about you?" I gestured with my head toward the DJ. "Do you sing?" "I do, actually." He spoke the words with great care. "But not like this." I did wonder what that could mean, but I also wondered where the barman was with my fresh drink, and the latter wondering took precedence over the former. It's funny how you can go out with your friends several weekends in a row and meet various different guys, potential love interests, none of them clicking, and then you meet one who does. Before long, Jack and I were doing that giddy, we just met and now we're comparing interests thing. You know the one, in which somehow it magically turns out you both have a lot in common, as though it might be an omen of something deeper, or at least you manage to manipulate things so that it would appear so. Typically, it's fairly obvious stuff. You both think J.M.W. Turner is the greatest British artist ever, and you're in agreement that John Cleese is the best Python. "What's your favourite colour?" "Blue." "You love blue?" "Me too." "I like breathing." "This is so amazing." "Me too." It was like that. And then, of course, our talk turned to books, TV, and film, followed by, inevitably, music. Even there it would appear we thought as one. Well, mostly. As he reeled off names of bands and individual artists, we were in surprising sync. The only thing we differed on was Bon Jovi. They were brand spanking new on the scene, and while he foresaw a great future, at the time all I could see was hair, and not in a good way. But since his own was more conservatively cropped, I got the impression that my thoughts on the band from the wrong jersey were as much a relief to him as anything else. And thankfully he was wise enough not to ask if I was Beatles or Led Zeppelin. It's my experience that that's a debate best not had upon just meeting a new man, because while some people can be both Beatles and Led Zeppelin, that's by no means always the case, and it's just too much of a risk. "What do you think of them?" he asked with a head gesture toward the latest karaoke singer, who was murdering frustration even worse than the guy who'd attempted it a half-hour earlier. "You mean the guy singing karaoke?" He'd said them, but there was only one person singing. Perhaps he'd drunk too much and was seeing double, or maybe I'd drunk too much and was only seeing one where there should be two. No, it was definitely just one singer. "No." He spoke in an even voice. "The band who originally recorded the song." I tried to figure out what he was looking for, in that way you sometimes do with a new man you've just met, when you think you're still playing the "we just met and now we're comparing interests" game. We'd been getting on so well, I didn't want to louse things up. And I'd already crossed him once, on Bon Jovi. I didn't want to run the risk of crossing him twice. Unfortunately, his face was neutral, a bloody Switzerland of uselessness. Then I remembered that eye roll from earlier, which it appeared might be a clue. "Well," I proceeded cautiously, "I suppose they are a bit overrated." "A bit over—" He barked a laugh. "Yes, I'd say that's exactly right." "You're not a fan, then?" "You might say that." Then he launched into a laundry list critique of everything wrong with Denny and his band, the exaggerated dance moves that ran the risk of overflowing into self-caricature, the occasional over-eagerness to pump out a hit single attached to the latest music craze, like disco nearly a half-decade ago, almost sure to cause embarrassment later on in a career, not even fit enough for a greatest hits album, even if Disco Balls to You had charted at #1 in 1978. What self-respecting rock and roll band would commit such a musical faux pas? And what about that label, the greatest rock and roll band in the world? Could such a thing be empirically proven? And if not, why claim it? I found myself nodding in agreement with what he said, because everything he said was technically true. So, really, he said at one point, stopping his own tirade long enough to solicit my opinion. You're really not a fan? Not in the slightest, I reassured him. It wasn't even until our second date, well, our first if you don't count the drunken meeting in the pub as a date per se, that I learned his last name was Springer too, just like the lead singer for the band he wasn't a fan of. I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me. Denny was already on the front stoop, a lit cigarette dangling from his fingers. On the edges of the concrete, not much bigger than a postage stamp, stood 2 bodyguards, dressed in suits, and in front of the house was parked a long white limousine, the liveried driver leaning against the front of the car enjoying his own cigarette break. A chauffeur and 2 bodyguards. Denny had needed all this just to visit his parents for the holiday. What did he need the bodyguards for? In the city I could understand it, maybe. But here, what did he think was going to happen? That old Mrs. Parker across the way was going to maul him for an autograph? Instead of revering him, she was more likely to pity his parents. Poor Edith, I could hear her saying. At least my Darren comes to see me every week. But when's the last time that one was around? Oh, I wish for her sake he'd get a proper job. Give up all that nonsense. Mona, Denny said with what could only be described as a slight leer. Did you come out here for some alone time with me? I regarded my brother-in-law from my height, even in flats, of 1 inch taller than him. Only 5'7" to Jack's 6 feet. Denny had gotten his mum's height while Jack got their dad's. It was always a surprise to see Denny in person, to stand so close to him like this, and realise how slight he was. When on stage he always towered larger than life. And yet somehow no room was big enough for him. No room could contain him. I ignored his question as I lit a cigarette, squinting at him through the smoke and gesturing with my chin. What's with the sunglasses? It's not that bright out. In truth, the sun was shining, but it was late March shine, not a July one, and the day was brisk. His hair looked amazing, exactly as it did in all the recent pictures. That brown, shaggy cut with hints of gold and even silver and bronze glimmering through. Honestly, if you got rid of the brown bits and braided up the rest, it'd look like that tri-coloured jewellery that was so trendy in the shops. But that long scarf around his neck and those sunglasses, was this supposed to be him travelling incognito? Because if that was the case, he should have ditched the bodyguards, the scarf and the sunglasses in the suburbs in March, and no one would be the wiser for his presence here. Their prescription, he said, sounding wounded. I have light, sensitive eyes. Yeah, right, first I'd heard of that. Let's walk, I said, stepping off the stoop. If any smoke gets in the window crevices, your mum will have a cow. Despite my words, I loved Denny's mum. But I didn't want her to have another cow, because as far as I could tell, she'd already had one. Him. Worse than the Americans, he muttered again, which I guessed was currently the worst epithet he could think of. Still, despite his grumbling, he followed my lead. He stole a concerned glance at the empty street. I suspect he was wary of the hordes that would no doubt descend demanding autographs should he step out into it. So I took pity on him, instead circling the house on the small patch of grass surrounding it, Digger nipping at our heels, the bodyguards trailing close behind us, just in case. I don't know about him, but I felt ridiculous.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?